Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into an exploration of literacy that really goes beyond the usual stuff, flashcards and phonics. We're looking at the intense, um, years-long journey of a Gestalt Language Processor, GLP, into reading, access, and finally, well, belonging.
Yeah, we've got an incredibly powerful first-hand account today. It really challenges that basic idea that if you're just surrounded by books, you'll learn to read them. It forces us to ask a pretty tough question. What happens when, the way your brain is set up for language just clashes head-on with how schools usually teach reading?
Okay, let's unpack that straight away because the tension here sounds almost excruciating. So the author grew up in what, education experts call a print-rich environment. Picture it. Shelves everywhere in the Sears kit home. Books like Burns, P.G. Wodehouse, Rumpole of the Bailey. Sounds like a reader's dream, right?
You'd think so. And yet for her, all those books were actually a source of, well, profound pain. She talks about that term print-rich, feeling clinical and even smug, like the library wasn't this welcoming feast.
But more like a taunt.
Exactly. A taunt, an agony of almost. The sheer availability of all that knowledge just highlighted the fact that she couldn't get to it, her exclusion.
So our mission for you, the listener, is to really try and understand that internal experience. This isn't someone who didn't like books. This is someone who loved them deeply, but just couldn't find the key.
Yeah.
We need to figure out why those traditional methods, the path everyone expects you to take, why that became such a barrier for a Gestalt mind.
Precisely. And when we talk about GLP, Gestalt Language Processing, we mean a mind that picks up language in whole chunks, like musical phrases, entire storylines, these complex units. It doesn't start with breaking down sounds, ABC. That's critical, because the standard way we teach reading, decoding sound by sound is just fundamentally incompatible with how that brain is processing language.
Okay, let's dive into that feeling of exclusion. The author talks about loving the objects themselves. The smell of old paper, the weight of the book, the curve of letters, the promise on the cover. But when she tried to engage, her hand passed through air. She just couldn't enter those worlds.
It's such a painful, beautiful metaphor, isn't it? For being functionally illiterate, despite being bright and curious. And what's really fascinating here is that her internal experience of language was already super rich. Language lived inside her as music, rhythm, cadence, all carried through voices reading aloud to her.
Yeah, she wasn't empty of language at all. Quite the opposite. She had this huge library inside her head. She could remember complex dialogue, whole plots, tiny details from stories months after hearing them. These whole phrases, gestalts, had lodged themselves like river stones smoothed by repetition.
That phrase, river stones smoothed by repetition, that's key. That's the heart of stage 1 or stage 2 GLP, where those complete, meaningful units are the building blocks. Now think about that internal richness and contrast it with being asked to decode, the single letter C or A in a phonics drill.
Wait, okay, so if the language is already stored as these big, sophisticated rhythmic wholes like the finished house, basically, how does forcing someone to dismantle it down to the individual bricks, the fragments, how does that mess things up?
Well, it creates a kind of cognitive traffic jam. Her system is built for recognizing patterns, for auditory memory, for these whole gestalts. When you interrupt that flow, that music, and force this analytical piece-by-piece decoding task, it essentially bypasses the system that's actually working really well for her, the memory retrieval system. The source confirms this. Those thin black lines on the page stayed as code because her brain wasn't wired to process language analytically first. It needed the whole picture.
And that's where the exclusion shifts, becoming this systemic betrayal in the classroom. That's the crux of it. Literacy wasn't presented as something to explore, but as a territory policed, very narrow entry rules, and the shame hit hard and fast. Being functionally illiterate in a quote-unquote good school with all those books around, it meant you were labeled dumb or incapable.
Absolutely. The failure was never framed as, maybe the method doesn't fit the child's neurology. No, instead, when the phonics drills didn't work, when the charts were useless, the blame landed squarely on the student. Being told constantly, sound it out or just try harder, it caused her system to just collapse.
Which really highlights that paradox she felt. The shelves promised abundance, but the classroom delivered scarcity. Scarcity of imagination, of patience, of methods that actually worked for her.
Exactly. Scarcity of flexibility. And the psychological weight of that scarcity must have been just enormous.
Yeah, corrosive is the word the author uses. She talks about spending years just surviving, becoming an expert bluffer.
Right, using her amazing memory and pattern recognition skills to hide the reading deficit. Imagine the constant stress, the vigilance, the fear of being found out for decades. That kind of pressure just cements that feeling of personal failure. It prevents any real joyful engagement with reading.
That sustained pain, that deep shame, it leads us right to the breakthrough moment. And this wasn't some quick fix or a new app. The turning point didn't happen until her 30s, long after she'd sort of resigned herself to this limitation.
And this is where the story gets really powerful.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a new technique. It was a miracle of recognition. It came from a mentor who saw the gap, understood the struggle, and didn't turn away. This mentor didn't try to fix the author.
They critiqued the method.
Exactly. That was a crucial realization. The trouble was not me, it was the method. That single shift reframes everything. Decades of feeling deficient suddenly recontextualized as a systemic failure.
Wow.
And instead of seeing her gestalts, her echoes, her incredible narrative memory as problems to be stamped out, the mentor saw them as strengths, as the foundation to build upon. They understood you have to start where the learner actually is, not where some curriculum checklist says they should be.
And the impact was immediate. Liberation. She started reading without resentment, without shame. It stopped being about trying to comply and became about actual joy, getting lost in a book, finding companionship in the text.
And those bookshelves, right. The ones that had been like a fortress guarding knowledge she couldn't reach.
They became home.
Yes. But the mentor did more than just teach a skill. The source makes a point of this. The mentor opened doors, provided connections, work opportunities, a community.
That's such an important distinction. It wasn't just about being seen for a moment. Providing community moved her into genuine belonging. Literacy transformed from just a decoding skill into like a social identity, a way to integrate into a supportive world.
It fundamentally changes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Literacy is a key unlocking so much intellectual and social power. And once she had that key,
Yeah.
the floodgates just opened.
And what an abundance came next. Her personal library just exploded. She describes having 14 shelves now, literally sagging under the weight of books, plus this huge digital library with thousands more volumes.
It's a staggering physical symbol of reclaiming that intellectual space.
Yeah.
And her reading life became this way to sort of repay the debt to her younger self, who could only listen. She went back to the authors she'd heard, Longo, Le Guin, but then dove into really complex stuff: philosophy, Marxist critique, sci-fi, feminist theory, really broad.
It makes so much sense, too, that someone whose mind naturally works with rhythm, cadence, whole patterns would find her birthright, as she calls it, in that long tradition of Gale's using poetry and story to carry history and memory.
I completely agree. Her system was kind of designed for epic recitation, these sophisticated whole structures, not for breaking things into tiny pieces.
It really flips that deficit narrative completely.
Yeah, it does. And notice the mix in her library. The digital tools gave her vital support: speed, searchability, accessibility that print alone couldn't offer her initially.
But the physical book is still essential. She talks about needing them as sensory anchors. You know, the smell of the ink, the feel of the spine-resisting, things that let memory take root in the flesh. It's like an integration of the digital ease and the physical embodied experience.
And the result isn't just someone who can read. She became a poet, a teacher, a writer. Those shelves are testimony. Proof that the child who just yearned to belong finally achieved her, well, destiny fulfilled. She even mentions the whimsy and choice she has now, like sitting among her books in a flowing maxi skirt. Such a contrast to the rigid compliance demanded of her as a child.
Okay, so this abundance, this fulfillment, it leads us to her pretty fierce defiance towards the educational gatekeepers. She's crystal clear. She'd gained literacy in spite of the people who dismissed her experience, who said GLP was a mirage, or kept chanting no evidence.
Right. Her main critique is aimed at institutions that basically narrow the scope of what they're willing to look at. By sticking rigidly to this narrow analytical meter stick, they end up just measuring fragments and ignoring anything that doesn't fit easily. And they treat a child's rich, echo-filled musical language as if it's just a deficit to be drilled away.
It raises a really profound ethical point, doesn't it? She calls this institutional mindset a tool of erasure, basically, disguised as being rigorous or ethical. When your measuring tool actively excludes something that's obviously real in a child's lived experience, where does the problem actually lie? With the child or the tool?
Yeah, she challenges clinicians directly. Choose the child over the neat data points, especially if your protocol tells you to ignore what the child is clearly doing, like reciting whole, complex scripts. She argues that a field protecting its status by declaring unmeasurable things unreal isn't really a field of inquiry. It's more like a closed-off guild.
And she calls on researchers to widen the frame, build tools that can actually register things like prosody, narrative structure, and crucially, invite autistic scholars, GLP thinkers, into genuine collaboration, co-authorship.
It's the difference between studying about a group and building knowledge with them.
Yeah.
It's really a demand for systemic accountability. Her own life stands as proof that their standard methods were not just ineffective for her, but actively damaging. They reduced a complex, capable mind to just a failure to decode.
So what's the big takeaway here for us, for the listener? The journey went from like tease to exclusion to betrayal, then finding the key, and finally to abundance. It shows literacy isn't just about being near paper and ink. It depends on finding that bridge. And that bridge only appears when understanding replaces judgment.
Absolutely. And maybe the most powerful message, beyond just literacy, is about self-trust. The author sends this message back to her younger, terrified self. That intense longing wasn't pointless, and the evidence of her own body, the echoes, the patterns, the music inside, that should have been trusted more than the external theories telling her she was broken.
That really hits home. That's the core of this deep dive. She says, the words, still imperfect, arrive late, but never empty.
Indeed. And it leaves us with that stark contrast, doesn't it, between the sort of nervy declarations of no evidence from some gatekeepers and the author's undeniable, lived evidence of breadth and page and practice. So maybe the thought to leave you with is this. What gate are you standing in front of right now, believing the hinges won't budge, when maybe, just maybe, it's the method, not your own capacity, that's the real problem?